Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, May 14th, and we have quite a bit to get to. A lot of stuff broke right after the show last week, but we have time to get to it officially today. We're going to start talking about the 16-team playoff. That is something that has started to gain traction around the SEC and the Big Ten camps. Something we're going to want to talk about, get into a little bit, because it has big-time implications for what the future of college football will look like, and there's pros, there's a couple more cons, but we'll get into all of that in the first segment. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the different things happening around the sports commission that was set up by Donald Trump not too long ago. Nick Saban is going to be the co-chair. Cody Campbell will be joining him as a co-chair as well, and we'll get into him and kind of his story in that segment. Then we'll get into all the other news that has kind of come off across the week with a couple of different interesting things to get across on y'all's brains. And then we'll finish it off. We'll do a little of my post-spring top 25. I did my top 10 last week. If you want to go check out that video, please do. But also going to do 11 through 25 today. And very, very hard to put together a couple of teams that were left off that I don't feel great about. But at the end of the day, there's a number of different things there that I think it's really fun to break down as we get to the end of spring practice. But let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's jump into the 16-team playoff because it is a big deal. It is the next kind of iteration of what the playoff is going to look like. At least that's what it sounds like. I think all of us understand that going into the 2026 season, we're very likely going to have a different format for the playoff, whether that's going to be a more expansive, 14 team or a 16 team playoff, or it's going to be something entirely different where they just keep it at 12 teams but kind of play around with how the seeding works. Maybe those conference champions don't get the buys that they have gotten. Maybe that will go into place this year. There's a lot of moving parts around this, but in terms of the 16 team playoff, in terms of what could happen in 2026, let's jump into this really quickly. And I think the biggest thing to remember here is there's a lot of power in the SEC and Big Ten's hands. Whether we want it to be that way or not, that is the world that we live in right now in the college sports, and that's the way this is going to unfold. So for the 16-team playoff, the way it will be currently formatted, or at least the way the format that is gaining the most traction, at least as of right now in these discussions, is the SEC and the Big Ten would get 4 auto bids each. So they would take up at the very least half of the entire field for the 16-team playoff. Then you would get 2 each for the ACC and the Big 12. So whoever went to the championship games for those two conferences, they're automatically in. Iowa State would have been in this past year from the Big 12, not just Arizona State. And then one group of 5 auto bid for whoever is the top group of 5 team. Was Boise State this year, would be someone else, and that's not a change from the 12 team. And then 3 at-large bids, and you have to imagine that those three would probably be taken up by the SEC and the Big Ten, and obviously that is everyone's biggest beef. The SEC and the Big Ten being able to get 4 auto bids each and not necessarily have to worry too much about what's going on around them, what's going on in the ACC and the Big 12. They focus on what's going on in their conference, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but that is a very, very interesting concept, and it is something that makes people very frustrated, and I totally understand that approach. Not saying that those people are wrong by any means. What I will say is if you were going to get to a 16-team playoff, I mean, we just saw a 12-team, and you had, I believe, 3 SEC teams in there with Tennessee, Texas, and Georgia, and you had 4 Big Ten teams with Penn State, Ohio State, Indiana, as well as Oregon. So you already kind of got close, if we're being totally honest. You got very close to this possibly happening. Alabama almost jumped SMU and got in as well. That would have been 8 teams from the SEC and the Big Ten in that thing. So just to keep that in mind, it almost already happened with a 12-team playoff if we went to 16 teams. And I know a lot of people kind of advocate for the idea of all at-large bids, just no auto bids at all, and that's something that I used to be very much in favor of, and I would be very much in favor of in a smaller playoff format. But I think when you get to the 16-team playoff format, I think you're going to realize that the ACC getting 2, the Big 12 getting 2, the Group of 5 even getting 1 might be a little bit more generous. If we go to the at-large bids, I don't think there's anything stopping these people from putting 12 SEC and Big 10 teams in, 14 of teams from those two conferences into this thing if there's no guardrails, and if we're measuring strength of schedule the right way. There's a real reality where at-large bids could actually lead to more SEC and Big Ten teams being in this dance than would be in this current format. So it's not my favorite format. I want to make that very, very clear. If I had the ball in my hands, I would go backwards quite a bit. Maybe even back to the 4-team playoff, probably back to an 8-team. I think that's kind of the right number right about now. I used to be in favor of 6, but don't necessarily love the bye system given how much college football has changed and how somewhat the scales are evening. Very much want it to be kind of a straightforward, no one gets a bye type of approach. So I would be at 8 teams, and I'd probably do all at large bids and go from there and rank strength of schedule the right way and do it that way. But the reality is we're down this road and we're not going backwards. So it looks like 16 teams is gaining a lot of traction. 14 is still very much on the table, but regardless, the SEC and the Big Ten are going to hold a lot of power here. They're going to get a lot of auto bids. They're going to get more auto bids than just about everyone else, and that's just kind of the reality. No matter how you cut this thing, there will be more SEC and Big Ten teams in this every single year than every other conference. I can promise you that. But this does add an interesting question because you got four auto bids for the SEC and the Big Ten, and you have to figure out how those teams get in. Who are the 4 teams? Is it just the top 4? Well, it sounds like there's going to be some implications on championship weekend that might not be around the top 2 teams. It could very well be that the top 2 teams just don't play that weekend. That's kind of the reward for being the top 2 teams in the conference. They get to roll off, get their week off, maybe even 2 weeks off, depending on the formatting of the playoff, and then you get to move into the playoff fully healthy. We've seen that rest versus rust is a big kind of debate, and we can talk about that as this kind of gets a little bit further down the road, but it would be a 3rd place versus 6th place and a 4th place versus 5th place matchup in both those conferences. So I believe this year the 3rd place in the SEC was Tennessee. I believe Tennessee was there, and then Ole Miss was at 6, if I'm not mistaken. Could have been someone different. Apologies if so. But regardless, it would be those type of matchups. So Tennessee against Ole Miss, let's say, or Alabama against LSU, or something like that for those final 2 spots. Up in the Big Ten, you could have Indiana against Illinois, or Penn State against, Wisconsin, whoever it is, ends up being that 3rd or 6th team or that 4th or 5th team, they'll end up playing for those other 2 spots. So the top 2 teams, they are in, no problem, could play a conference championship, could not. I would love to see them play a conference championship, but understand that that's kind of a bygone thought, so we'll see what happens there, but it does sound like there will be play-in games for this, and it'd be really interesting to see how that would unfold and would add more games to conference championship weekend. Maybe not the games that we want to see, but definitely more games, and would be very, very interesting to watch. So that's what you have. You have 4 auto bids for the SEC and the Big Ten with play-in games for the 3rd through 6 seeds. They play play-in games to get those final 2 spots. The ACC and the Big 12 is pretty straightforward. Whoever makes the conference championship will make the CFP. Will they play that game to figure out seeding is a whole other conversation. The group of 5 teams, and then the at-large bids, you can bet they're going to be losers from these play-in games from the SEC and the Big Ten. At least I would bet that pretty comfortably. But now we know the format. Now we know how this is going to break down. There are some things I don't love about it. There's some things that I think are actually relative pros. And let's go ahead and get into the pros right now, and then we'll get into the darker side of this here in a second. But for the pros, the one thing that I absolutely love, and something that I kind of overlooked until I listened to Josh Pate talk about this, was this will give importance to the conference races. One way or another, you are going to have to worry about where you sit in your conference, not just where you sit in the CFP poll. And I think that's kind of a big beef around the CFP format that we have right now, where it just doesn't feel like these conference games hold as much weight as you would like them to. It doesn't feel like they hold any more weight than the out-of-conference game you played in week 2 or the rivalry game you play out of conference in the last week of the season. Just doesn't feel like these games matter as much as they probably should. This would put more emphasis on that one way or another. If you get to the end of the year and you have, let's say, 3 or 4 teams in the SEC that are 9-3, and they're all hanging out between 3 and 7, that's going to be a really, really hard fight to the very, very last weekend to figure out who gets 3 versus 4, who gets 4 versus 5, and we'll see what happens there. So it's going to be one of those things where we have a position where, yes, we are losing a little bit of, we're losing those at-large bids. We're giving a lot of power to the SEC to be able to do whatever they please and kind of get 4 teams in no matter what. We're also putting a little bit more emphasis on these conference games, on these conference races. Obviously, the Big 12 and the ACC were already pretty intense because they understood they pretty much had to win the conference or at least be very close to get in. But the reality is, it will add a little bit of juice to some of those SEC games that this past year, just being totally honest, didn't have much juice at all. There were a lot of SEC games that you're looking at and you're saying, whether they win or lose, especially early in the season, doesn't make much of a difference. It very well could now. So I do really like that aspect of it. You're putting a lot of emphasis on conference races and playing your guys as hard as you possibly can in those conference games. And I think that's a big time pro. We'll get to the con that goes with that here in a second. But another pro here is you will never have an undeserving champion ever again. I can promise you that. And I really don't think that existed before, if I'm being totally honest. I don't necessarily think that was a thing that really was running rampant in the sport, that we had undeserving champions, quote unquote. But the reality is, we saw what Ohio State just did. And in a lot of other years, if they had lost to Michigan, but then somehow gotten into the 14 field and gotten hot for 2 games, some people would have discredited it. Some people would have said, they were just hot at the right time. They weren't actually the best team in the country, but they were very deserving champions because they walked through Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, and then Notre Dame to win that national championship. So regardless of being 10-2, regardless of not playing their best football and maybe not being an overly deserving team at the very end of the year to win the national title, at least end of the regular season, they then became a very deserving champion. As they went through the 12 team, would be the exact same thing with the 16 team. You have to beat those elite teams somewhere along the way, even if you're a Boise State somehow and you find your way into the dance after playing a cupcake schedule. If you find a way to win 4 games against elite teams, you're a very deserving champion. So that's the other part of it that I don't think was necessarily running rampant in the sport before. I don't think it was a crazy, crazy thing, but you go back to the BCS days and there were definitely some controversial picks for who's that second team in that championship, and sometimes you do have that kind of that debate at the end of the year. Was that the best team in the country, or was that just the team that was in the right spot at the right time? That will no longer be the case. It's just about, can you beat elite teams week over week, and that's exactly what Ohio State did. Definitely going to have to do it in the 16-team era. So I think that's another pro. And then finally, a pro that makes me kind of upset. I'll be totally honest with you, but it is a pro nonetheless. The SEC and the Big Ten might stick around with the rest of the sport, and that's a big deal, one way or another. It's not something that I think a lot of us love, the idea that the SEC and the Big Ten every couple of years just get to hold the sport kind of hostage as they get what they want, and then we can move forward as a sport once they do. That's a frustrating model, and I fully agree with that, and we'll talk about the commission here in a second and see how that could possibly fix some of the issues with that. But the reality is, right now, you want to keep this sport intact. You want to make sure that there isn't a world where in 5 years the SEC and the Big Ten go off and start their own football entity and kind of break off from everyone else. And with that, cause huge, huge problems in the world of college football, not in the world of the SEC or the Big Ten, but in the world of everyone else. Would definitely cause a ton of problems, and that's something that you have to avoid, at least in the short term, as we try to figure out what the new structure of college football is going to be, who the governing body is going to be, and all of that different type of stuff. The goal is to keep these 2 guys here, and that's a very, very difficult thing to do. This is something that might just be a necessary evil, I guess is the best way to put it, is giving these teams a little bit more leeway, a little bit more of a bump, because you need them in this sport if you're going to keep afloat for the next little bit. The cons, which are a little bit more plentiful and a little bit more serious in my estimation, the biggest one is more non-CFP level teams will make the CFP. That's just the reality. I think we saw it last year, not to throw shade at Michigan, and they obviously didn't make it last year, but just to say, if a Michigan team that goes 8-4 in a not so strong Big Ten, let's just say, they find a way to go 8-4, they end fourth in the conference, they find a way into the dance. Or I guess they would play that play-in game, but they would still have the ability to find their way into the playoff, even as an at-large team at the end of the day. So that's not a CFP level team. I have always believed that it should be a remarkably exclusive club to get into the CFP, and it should be really, really hard to win a national title. You should have to be near perfect to win a national title. Now, Ohio State kind of debunked that theory a little bit, but I do think there's a reality where you're allowing teams that just don't really belong in a CFP type setting into the CFP, and you're creating some problems there. You're really just giving them another chance to cash a check, and that's something we'll talk about here in a second, because that's my biggest beef with this. But another huge beef I have is, Out-of-conference schedules will be ruined by this. I can absolutely promise you that. Now, you might have some G5 teams that keep trying to schedule up to get one of those big marquee wins or at least help themselves in the strength of schedule department to try to edge out maybe another group of 5 team. But when you look at games coming up, we have Ohio State, Texas to kick off the year, which we'll talk about that in the next segment. But the reality of the matter is, if this was put into place 3 years ago, they would have canceled those games. I know we have, I believe, Notre Dame's playing a series against, oh, I'm blanking on the team right about now. I believe they're playing Alabama in a series coming up over the next couple of years. I know they just scheduled one with Clemson for 12 years going forward from 2027 all the way to 2038. I can almost assure you that if this is put into place, both those teams will say, why are we doing this? Why are we putting ourselves in this position? Maybe Notre Dame's a little bit different because they're only eligible for those at-large bids, but the reality of the matter is, what would be the benefit for Clemson to play that Notre Dame game, possibly have some guys get more dinged up than they normally would, and then go into conference play a little bit worse than you normally would if you were able to play a Charleston Southern? So that's the other reality of this. If you put so much emphasis on the conference races, which should be the emphasis of the sport, I fully agree with that, but you are going to lose the out-of-conference games, or at least some of them. Maybe some teams are still going to be more than willing to schedule tough, and that has a little bit more to do with the committee than anything else, being able to weigh, strength of schedule the right way to prioritize these teams and incentivize these teams to schedule really hard games. But at the end of the day, doesn't seem like they're doing that right now. And if I was Texas, if I was Ohio State, and I had big time games scheduled in the future, but I knew they weren't going to have a bearing on what I did in the CFP or my positioning in the CFP, I'd probably cancel those games and just make sure that I'm ready, make sure I'm playing my best football, and make sure I'm fully healthy going into those conference games. So that is a big drawback. The season would essentially start around week 4 when those conference games started, and I don't think any of us want that either. And then the biggest one to me is they can keep selling the big CFP lie. The lie that has been told time and time again as we talk about the CFP, the lie that just goes essentially like the more teams that are in the CFP, the more teams have a chance to win the national title. That is not the case. Let's just be totally honest with each other. Boise State was not walking into that Fiesta Bowl, beating Penn State, then walking right over to the Cotton Bowl, beating Notre Dame, and then finding a way to beat Ohio State in the national title. They did not have a shot to win the national title. They were only 3 wins away from it. Those 3 wins were going to be impossible for Boise State to get. It didn't matter that they were in the CFP. It didn't matter that they were in the dance. They got another chance to play a game. They got another chance to cash a paycheck and then move on forward. And that's not necessarily to say they didn't belong. It's not to say that they don't belong going forward in these in the CFP, in these matchups. But the reality of the matter is, adding more teams to the CFP does not give more teams the ability to win the national title. What it does is give more teams the ability to play one more game. You get to play one more game where you go on the road and get absolutely buried. That's the reality of this situation. So I understand, the idea of a Boise State winning a national title is awesome. The idea of an Arizona State coming out of nowhere last year and being able to get to the promised land is incredible. It's not going to happen. Just plain and simple. These teams that are getting in from certain conferences, or these teams that are getting in at large, they don't necessarily have the resources, the ability, the guys to win a national title. So that's the reality. The same amount of teams are going to be able to win a national title right now as they're going to be able to win it in the 16-team playoff, as they're going to be able to win it in the 24-team playoff. The reality is more teams just get a chance to say, I was a CFP team this year, which is all well and good, just doesn't enhance the sport all that much. It doesn't change the sport by any means. It just creates kind of this mess at the end of the year where you look at the CFP bracket and say, does that team really belong here? Does that team really have a shot to win the national title? And for the vast majority of those teams in the 16-team playoff, the answer is going to be no. So I absolutely hate that. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's the idea of you get to go to the big boy table, you get to sit at the parents' table at Thanksgiving, but your seat is very, very low. You barely see over the table. You don't get to get a word in edgewise. You're not actually at the table. You just get to feel like you're at the table. So it's one of those things that I fully understand why people want more teams in it. I fully understand why they want other teams to have a shot to win the national title. The reality of the matter is, adding more teams to this thing will not give more teams the ability to win the national title. it will give them the hope that they possibly could. And that's the only reality there. So it's a back and forth thing. And I think the reality is, and I think with a lot of people, the reality is the cons far outweigh the pros, at least in my personal opinion. The other thing to remember in all of this, when you're talking about conference expansion, when you're talking about CFP expansion, when you're talking about all of the changes in college sports, the SEC and the Big Ten are going to win. Plain and simple. They are going to win this battle one way or another, whether it's moving to a 16-team playoff and getting 4 auto bids, whether it's moving to a 14-team and getting 3 auto bids each, whether it's breaking off and being their entire separate entity all by itself. They are going to win this battle. You have to find a way to keep them intact for the time being and then put in a 16-team playoff that sort of makes sense. I don't love a 16-team playoff. If it were up to me, we'd probably go back to 8 teams and we'd start working in all at-large bids. We'd probably play around with a group of 5 playoff. I'd make a lot of changes. So the reality of the matter is I hate CFP expansion. I hate it when it happened first. I hate it now. It's something that I wish we could go back on and make right. That's not going to happen. So the best thing we can do right now is just make the best out of a bad situation. Hopefully, they set this thing up to where we still can have great out-of-conference games, and those can be weighted the way that they should be for those at-large teams. We can still have intense SEC and Big Ten championship games because they will matter in the CFP race. Hopefully, we can have all of these things. I think the reality is some of those things are going to go by the wayside, and it's not something that I want to see happen. It's also something that I understand that we're probably not going to be able to be fighting for very much longer. So it's a battle back and forth. And I think there's a lot of people that will say it's a great idea because look at the ratings that it'll bring, look at all the people that will watch, look at the teams that will have a shot to win the national title. Maybe I'm a little bit too pessimistic, but I don't think it changes the amount of teams that have a chance to win the national title. I think it just changes the amount of teams that get to have that CFP patch on their jerseys in December. So I don't necessarily throw, tires at you if you are fully in favor of the 16 team. I'm just not. I don't get it. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's way more necessary to go backwards than forwards. We're not getting that from this group of people. They want a little bit more money in their pockets, and they're going to do whatever they can to get that. So that's the reality of where we're sitting right now. The SEC and the Big Ten are holding all the power. They're starting to lean towards the 16-team playoff. You can probably imagine that that's where we're going to end up. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. We'll talk about it more. Their CFP changes could come as early as this year. I don't think it's going to go to 16 teams this year, but very well could change up just a little bit this year, and we'll get into it when it does. We'll talk about it all as it unfolds, but let's take our first break here. Went a little bit long-winded, but was quite upset when that news came out. But the reality is, let's take a little bit of a break here, and when we come back, we'll get into the NCAA Sports Commission that was set up by Donald Trump. We'll get into the details of that, how it's going to unfold, and the co-chairs of that, and how it's a very, very interesting duo that they have. But we'll talk about it all right after this, so stick with us.